So the future vision of peace brings good news, bad news, and a challenge for the next 30 to 50 years. The good news is there are many indications that we are headed into decades with great promise when it comes to deadly conflict. There are important things that are happening on the international stage and important things that are happening within conflict-affected societies that look promising, look hopeful, look good. The bad news is we're seeing a fair amount of violent conflict around the globe. This is Mogadishu, a place that's almost synonymous now with grinding conflict. It could be a building in many different places around the world. Conflict is a reality. Violent conflict is not necessarily a foregone conclusion, but we do see this kind of violent, destructive conflict gripping societies around the globe. That cannot be disputed. That's the bad news. The challenge is how do we pursue some of the promises, some of the opportunities that are starting to emerge from within these conflict-affected societies to address this kind of grinding, never-ending conflict. We call conflicts like this that appear to never end intractable. They resist resolution, and it always appears that if there's change, it's for the worse and not for the better. I think that the problem is not that the conflicts are never ending, it's that we are not paying attention to where the real action is when it comes to opportunities for shifting and changing and even transforming these conflicts. Most of my career for the last 20 years has been focused on big institutional approaches to big violent conflicts. Organizations like the United Nations, states, regional organizations, governments are focused at the highest levels on macro, broad-based, almost utopian visions of what it means to be at peace in societies. I preach that, I teach that, I believe in that. We need to have a big imagination when it comes to peace. The problem is that it's elusive. That utopian space, that institutional, global, national level change is elusive. I noticed many, many years ago in Iraq that the kinds of changes that actually were happening were at the micro scale, at the level of interactions between enemies. This is a picture that comes from a trip, some work that I did in Iraq, in which Iraqi Shia, Sunni Arabs, Kurds, Turkmen, Christians from many communities came together to first work together and second, enjoy the Kurdish holiday of Nowruz together. This was a historic moment. It looks tiny, but the implications of this were massive in an environment like Iraq, where the bifurcation and the stratification between and amongst groups is endemic and historic and deeply challenging. So I started to wonder, is this where the action is? Is this kind of integration where the actual change is taking place when it comes to the big conflicts that we've all been working on for so many years? I believe that we've been looking in the wrong place, at the wrong level. We've been hoping to see change at the level of the forest, but actually it's at the level of the trees that conflict-affected societies are actually shifting. There's an idea that a sociologist named Jeffrey Goldfarb offers called the politics of small things. It's when people meet and develop a capacity to act together to redefine their situation and to create alternatives to the existing order. He's suggesting, and I suggest, that these interactions, these small-scale connections are actually powerful in a political sense because they are occurring in the context of big, massive, unrelenting conflict that divides people at every level. When people connect in this way, I believe what's happening is the intimacy of enemies. It's a term that I've started to develop and work with, and I think would like to offer in a provocative way. The intimacy of enemies is when local, everyday interactions occur that cross lines, that transgress the norms of conflict, that say we are working together even though everything in our society, from law to pop culture to media to political discourse, pushes us apart. We will work together. We will be together. We will interact. These create authentic possibilities. So this concept of the intimacy of enemies, this small scale, this micro level interaction, is where I believe the next 30 to 50 years will hinge on in terms of a vision for peace. And that is actually a very radical thing to say at a time when conflicts are so endemic. So is this urgent? Is this question of how do we make peace, is this an urgent question? Absolutely no question it is. Let's just take a few examples that everyone is aware of. Syria, 200,000 civilians killed at least in 6 years, with no real end in sight. We'll see where things go. Iraq, Afghanistan, 16 years of war. And you can fill in the blank. There's so many other conflicts that are gripping societies that seem to never end. These are important issues to grapple with. What is the cost? $14.3 trillion, it's estimated, annually spent or lost to violence. 12.6% of global GDP lost to violence. That's $1,953 for every single person on Earth. This is a crisis. We need new ways of addressing old problems. 2.14% of global peacefulness has been measured as going down since 2008. 52% of countries' level of peacefulness has been deteriorating since 2008. So this would suggest a trend towards the negative, a trend downward in terms of peacefulness. That's bad news, and it should get our attention. This is a picture from Egypt during some unrest not too long ago. One issue that's on the national stage that, again, is Myanmar. We can sort of get numbed by the numbers. 600,000 mostly Muslim refugees fleeing Myanmar for Bangladesh. It's so overwhelming. Here's one comment from one of those refugees, Abdul Salam, a very elderly man who made his way to Bangladesh with his family. He said, "In total, I escaped 4 times. In 1942, when the Japanese came, then again in 1978. The third time I can't remember, but this time was the most difficult. We had to cross 11 hills and spend 12 days hiding in the forest. I couldn't walk or see, so they had to carry me." The line that strikes me so powerfully here is the third time I can't remember. To be displaced by war and violence so many times that you can't remember what the cause was, that suggests we have a problem that needs to be resolved. It needs to be addressed. Peter Coleman, a great social psychologist, says, "We are a well-armed, frightened, highly suspicious, increasingly fractional, punitive disparaging of our opponents, and drowning in violence." So in this context, how can we envision peace? It's a dilemma. How do we, in the words of Elise Boulding, how do we image peace, vision peace in wartime? How do we grapple with that? My suggestion is we need to start looking at the details. We need to look at the cracks and the seams in these massive rocks of conflict. This is in East Timor, former Portuguese and then Indonesian, occupied by Indonesians after the Portuguese. In East Timor, where I worked for quite some time, again, I started to see this kind of intimacy, this kind of connection happening that was separate and apart from the big macro UN interventions or state-led interventions. And I saw that these small-scale connections had real meaning, had lasting capacity for change. But aren't we just warlike by nature, by definition? President Obama himself, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, said, "War in one form or another appeared with the first man. At the dawn of history, its morality was not questioned. It was a simple fact like drought or disease." So if war has been with us from the very beginning, maybe this doesn't make sense. The good news is it's a little more complicated than that. Doug Fry, an anthropologist, and others have noticed that the belief that there was always been war does not correspond with the archaeological facts of the matter. Other archaeologists, other anthropologists have helped us see that cooperation actually has historically been the norm, which is not to say war isn't a problem. It's just to say perhaps war isn't our entire history. So I'm saying two things now. First, we are not necessarily a warlike species, because historically and in the sort of historical record that is not borne out. And second, if you look in any conflict-affected society, you will see connections, intimacies between enemies in markets, in malls, in hair salons, in restaurants, sometimes in schools, in cinemas, and also in intentional intimacies, programming where people are coming together to mourn together, or to do art together, or to build new schools or new housing together. So that exists alongside and within conflict. So these two things, the lack of historical, warlike, purely warlike record for humanity, and the existence of these intimacies that we can see in any conflict-affected society, suggests that this is possible, that we can pursue this vision for peace. Kenneth Boulding said, if something exists, it is possible. That is a profound statement when it comes to the conflicts that are gripping these societies. This is again back to Iraq. Something that looks so mundane, a volleyball game. But what's represented here in this picture is fundamentally radical and fundamentally political, because the people in the picture come from every facet of Iraqi society at a time when those people are not supposed to be together. This is a political volleyball game, a meaningful and peace-oriented game of volleyball in the countryside of Iraq. So more and more, I believe that this is where we need to bring our focus. Here we are back to East Timor. The question of how do we bring small-scale interactions, how do we bring focus to that, how do we bring energy to that, how do we bring meaning to that, and how do we support those Timorese, Iraqis, Yemenis, Syrians, Libyans who are risking so much to create these intimacies because it's transgressive. It's against the rules for these communities to interact. Those may be informal rules, but they're no less powerful in keeping people apart. Here we are back to Iraq, and I want to tell a story about the first time I really understood the power of the intimacy of enemies. Many years ago, in my early work in Iraq, I convened and was a part of bringing together a very diverse group of Iraqis, came from every different part of society, every demographic. And at the end of the event, we just had people go around the group and close out the session with just sharing a little bit of their experience. And we emphasized that everyone was allowed to speak in their own language. I don't know if you're aware, but in Iraq there are many different languages spoken. Arabic, yes, but also Turkmen language, Chaldean, obviously Kurdish, and others. And so each person was invited to speak in their own language. The way that this session worked was that there was a small olive branch that was passed around from person to person. The olive branch came to a young Turkmen woman. She comes from the Turkmen minority in Iraq. And she started to speak and share in her language, in Turkmen. She was immediately interrupted by an older Arab man from a town called Bakuba who said, "Speak in Arabic. If you're Iraqi, you speak in Arabic." Myself and my Iraqi colleagues invited him to to be silent and allow her to take her time, and he relented. The olive branch went around and finally made it to this gentleman. He took the branch, he thought for a minute, and then he started his intervention, his conversation, with a short prayer. It starts, "In the name of God, most compassionate, most gracious," and he stopped. And the other participants were prompting him with the next word and the next word, and he held up his hand, and he started to weep. Big, burly man, big, thick hands, tears streaming down his face. The session ended, and at the very end, we said, "What do you think? How did this go?" And one of the young men said, "This was fine, but next time maybe you could teach us about democracy and how that works." I said, "Well, I think we have a little work to do back home, but let's see." At that point, the interrupter, the big, burly Arab Iraqi, stood up and he said, "I disagree. This was democracy. Why? Because we were all encouraged to speak in our own voice, in our own language, and that's what matters, and that's what's going to change Iraq." That moment was transformative and electric in that room, that the same man who couldn't even hear the language of a minority would then turn and shift and transform to embrace that as literally their reason for being there. That's what I mean when I say the intimacy of enemies. Another example, this one much larger scale. Every year in late April or early May, there's a Memorial Day event in Israel. Several years ago, a group of people came together and said, what we want to create is a binational Israeli and Palestinian co-mourning event, a Memorial Day that is together and not separate, which at the level of the concept is so radical because memorializing tends to be very nationalized. And so this group of people said, no, it's time to change the paradigm through which we mourn our dead. In May, I traveled to Tel Aviv, I traveled to the region, and I witnessed 4,000 people coming together at great risk to themselves and to the people that were around them to be a part of this massive multi-city Memorial Day event that, again, brought Palestinians and Israelis together to mourn those who had died. Not just those who had died, but those who had been killed by the co-mourners communities. And this was an intentional moment, and it was a profound moment. And what I saw was 4,000 plus people having the intimacy of enemies come alive in that room and trigger and galvanize and catalyze action. It's not just that moment, but it's what follows from that moment, the transformation, the shift, the changes that flow from that moment of intimacy. A huge, absolutely radical experience of coming together and sharing in sadness and pain. The next example I'd like to share is in Lebanon. And this looks like a pretty straightforward group of young people. It's actually some of the most important emerging leaders in Lebanon, from civil society, from business, from government, from research, from policy, at a relatively young age, coming together for a peace-building residential program that I helped co-direct with Lebanese and other professors. You can see a sense of connection here, but what you don't see is that these folks represent and themselves come from deeply, deeply divided, both historically and in terms of what's happening today, communities. And here they were coming together, talking about conflict in really unique and really unusual ways. And the intimacy that was created here had amazing residual effect. It doesn't just remain in that space of young people having a good time in a university for a few days in North Lebanon. One of the most powerful outcomes of this has been the creation by these Lebanese themselves of a range of really powerful and important organizations that are bringing this forward. One I'd like to highlight, Vanessa Basel created a groundbreaking organization focused on media and peace, called MAP. And she is now becoming a leader in the region, certainly in Lebanon and throughout, in terms of addressing how media can be either a part of the conflict dynamic or supportive of peace and inclusion and coexistence and pluralism. Are these intimacies solving the problem? Are they resolving conflict? Are they changing the fundamentals of social conflict? The answer is no. You'd have to be naive to think that the pictures that I showed you before were the beginning of the end of conflict. That's not what's happening. What's happening, though, is individuals, groups, and organizations who are stepping across lines in ways that you can't even imagine, risking family relationships, risking safety, risking security. The good news is I'm seeing this everywhere I look, partly because I want to see it, partly because I believe it's where the action is. And organizations like the United Nations are starting to take this very seriously, and more it's becoming a part of how business is done. Good news, 2017, first improvement in global peacefulness in global peacefulness since 2014. There's been a small uptick. 93 countries are actually becoming more peaceful this year, and 9 geographic regions have gained in a sense of peacefulness as measured by the GPI. So there's more work to be done, but certainly all points, in my view, all roads lead us back to this, the importance of intimacy, the importance of the everyday, the importance of mundane connections in which people are crossing lines and making real change in societies that are struggling. I think that there's hope. Thank you very much.